Hello, Cedar Creek Community Church. This past Sunday, we talked about the importance and the beauty of baptism. And I told you that I would be posting this video where we would look more in depth at the beauties of baptism, but specifically the difference between a believer's baptism and an infant baptism. At Cedar Creek Community Church, we believe in a believer's baptism, but I know so many godly, wonderful men and women of God who I respect incredibly that hold to a infant baptism. I want to clarify, when I say infant baptism, I am not talking about a Roman Catholic understanding of infant baptism. Catholicism teaches that when an infant is baptized, their original sin is washed away and it's almost a fresh start. A Protestant understanding of infant baptism does not hold to this in the least. It's an entirely different understanding. As I said, there are so many men and women in my life that I've studied under, that I've learned from, who disagree with me on this respect and hold to an infant baptism. But here at Cedar Creek Community Church, we believe in a believer's baptism. As we talk through this, I'm not going to be bashing other views. Again, these views are not identifiers as to how godly someone is or how useful they can be. So there's no point in bashing or criticizing any other views. I'm also not going to be using any arguments that have been made for believers' baptism that I believe are somewhat weak in Scripture. So you may be wondering why I didn't use a certain argument. That's on purpose. We want to focus in on something a little bit more specific today. Today we're going to be discussing a biblical systematic approach to the covenant and to baptism. We're going to be speaking about the purpose and the beauty of baptism. I want to discuss what has led many, including myself and our church, to believe in a believer's baptism, that baptism is reserved for individuals who have already been justified and not for children of people who have been justified. Before we jump into why we believe that in believer's baptism, I want to give a fair description, although short, of what infant baptism holds to. Infant baptism looks back to circumcision in the Old Testament. Circumcision was the identifier of God's covenant people. Therefore, everyone who was a part of God's covenant people was circumcised. Likewise, in the New Covenant, the covenant people, or the church, are not circumcised as the visible manifestation of being a part of the covenant, but rather they are baptized. Baptism is the picture, the identifier of being a part of the covenant. So just like covenant parents in the Old Testament had their children circumcised, so covenant parents now in the church ought to have their children baptized. Those who hold to this understanding of an infant baptism often use certain arguments against a believer's baptism that I believe don't hold much weight. One is in the Great Commission. The Great Commission tells us to go and make disciples, baptizing and teaching them to observe. They say that, baptism is the first step in making a disciple, that we need to baptize the infant and then we can begin teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. The issue with this in the Greek, these are simply two distinct participles. They're not dependent on one or the other. It's not saying baptize and then teach. It's saying these are two ways to make disciples. You baptize and you teach. They're not based on one another. Another example of an argument against believers' baptism that those who believe in infant baptism make, it comes from Acts chapter 16, verses 30 through 34. Let me turn there real quick. Acts chapter 16, verses 30 through 34. It's the story of the Philippian jailer. It says, "Then he brought them out and said, 'Sirs, what must I do to be saved?' And they said, 'Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household.' And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. And he took them the same hour of the night and washed their wounds, and he was baptized at once, he and all his family. Then he brought them up into the house and set foot before them, and he rejoiced along with his entire household that he had believed in God. The argument from someone who believes in infant baptism is that the jailer was saved, and therefore his entire family was baptized because of his justification. The issue with this argument is that we don't know that's the case. We're assuming that it was just the jailer who was justified. We're assuming that there were infants in the household. We don't know who was a part of the household. All we know is that the household was baptized after hearing the proclamation of the gospel. So this isn't a solid argument for either position on this issue of baptism. However, it is often an argument made against believers' baptism. So what is believer's baptism? We believe in a believer's baptism here at Cedar Creek Community Church. What does that mean? Well, we would agree with those who hold to an infant baptism that one aspect of baptism is an identifier as being a part of God's covenant people. We would agree with that sentiment. We see that in Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. Let me turn there. Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. It says, "In him also you were circumcised, with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful work of God, and who raised him from the dead. And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses." So we see the similar language between circumcision and baptism. He's saying those of you who are uncircumcised, you have been made a part of the covenant people through baptism. That the uncircumcised are now a part of the covenant people through the circumcision of the heart or through baptism. So we would agree that baptism is similar to circumcision in the Old Testament in that it is the identifier, the picture of being a part of God's covenant people. Circumcision was a sign in the Old Testament of God's covenant with Abraham, but it was also a sign of God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants, meaning his children and his children's children and his children's children. God made a covenant with his descendants, all of his descendants, and a sign of that covenant with his descendants was circumcision. So that picture of circumcision was commanded to be a part of all of his descendants, that was their symbol of the covenant. When they were born into this understanding that they were to be circumcised to be a part of the covenant. They were a part of the covenant as an infant. But not all of these descendants, not all of the descendants had faith. All right? Not all of the descendants had the faith of Abraham. So the covenant was made with Abraham's physical descendants. The physical descendants had a physical circumcision. Therefore, the nation of Israel, they continued in this physical circumcision. They continued to be circumcised, although their hearts did not abide by the covenant. All right? So they were physically circumcised, but that was it. All right? They did not abide by the covenant. They were not a part of the covenant people, yet they had this visible symbol of the covenant that was given to Abraham, and then they wandered away from the covenant. Then we see Christ coming. Christ did not come again to abolish the law, but he came to fulfill it, meaning that we are no longer under the law of works, but now we're under the law of Christ. We see this addressed in Romans chapter 2, verses 25 through 29. Romans chapter 2, verses 25 through 29. It says, "For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law." Meaning that if you, a descendant of Abraham, were circumcised and obeyed the law, it is of value. But if you break the law, if you didn't have the faith of Abraham, like many Israelites failed, but if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So if a man who is uncircumcised, physically uncircumcised, keeps the precepts of the law, keeps the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you, who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. You see, the misunderstanding that the Israelites had is that if they were physically circumcised, then they were a part of the covenant. But we see here Paul's telling the Romans that the circumcision wasn't what made them a part of the covenant. No, the circumcision was a picture that God gave them as a plan that the Israelites were God's chosen people. But what made them a part of God's covenant people was a circumcision of the heart. So the covenant people were not the physical people of Israel, but they were the true Israel, meaning those who had the faith of Abraham. The circumcision of the flesh wasn't the important part. It was the circumcision of the heart that was the determining factor of who is in the covenant. So we see that it's the physical children. The physical children doesn't make someone a part of the covenant. As we see in Romans chapter 9. Romans chapter 9 verse 8 says this. This means that it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise who are counted as offspring. Again, it's not a physical child. It's not the seed of someone. It's not the earthly child that makes you a part of the covenant. You're not a part of the covenant because you are someone's child. You are a part of the covenant because you are a child of the promise, or because you were justified by Christ. Physical children aren't the receivers of covenant blessings. The ones whom Christ saves are the receivers of the covenant blessings. So yes, just like circumcision was supposed to be a visible sign for God's covenant people, and yes, that included infants, because when the covenant was made, it was made with the nation of Israel, Abraham and his descendants. So now, under the law of Christ, under the new covenant, baptism is the physical sign of God's covenant people. It's the physical sign that we partake in as we are a part of God's covenant people. And we see that God's covenant people are not children of the flesh. God's covenant people are those who are justified. Therefore, justification is a precursor to baptism, because baptism is the visible sign of the invisible reality of our justification. Children of people who are justified are not a part of God's covenant people until they have been saved by Christ, until their justification. Then they are a part of God's covenant people and can receive the benefits of being a part of God's covenant people, one of which is baptism. So baptism is something that is reserved for God's covenant people, those who are justified. I hope that made some sense to you. That's why Cedar Creek Community Church holds to an understanding of believers' baptism in regards to the covenant. That's the main difference, but also a lot of similarities between the two understandings of believers' baptism and an infant baptism. If you have any questions about this, please leave a comment, send us a message, and we'll get in touch with you so we can further this conversation. We want you to understand this topic, so please let us know if you have any comments or questions at all, and we'll get back in touch. Thank you.